the oceans, their ability to deliver the expected services is increasingly challenged. The role of science in mitigating these challenges depends critically on its ability to produce actionable and timely knowledge. Our moderator for this panel is Dr. Daniel Pauly from the University of British Columbia, and he will moderate the discussion to help us better inform the rest of the symposium panels by understanding how the ocean researchers view these present-day and future challenges from their disciplinary perspectives and as part of the global ocean science community as a whole. Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel Pauly. Please feel free to introduce your panel participants.
So we have a panel, good morning. We have a panel devoted to technology integration for the marine science. I am a fisheries scientist. This is marginal for most of you, and I will claim that it is actually not marginal because most of what we do out of what we get out of the ocean is fish, actually, which we eat.
We will accommodate questions from the audience through either MediaCast software, so please feel free to log in and utilize that, and they will come to the iPad and we'll read them out, or we will also try to provide the microphones to those who have questions. Thank you.
A household question I could ask the other panelists, when are they coming? Should I introduce each of them?
Yes, let's have them. Please, panelists, come to the stage and grab your microphones.
Because I feel very lonely here. What I was saying is, I do not put the beginning of oceanography with the Challenger, contrary to what was said before, but with Commander Maury at the beginning in about 1850. He asked mariners to send him data, and he returned maps. That was the first big integration of oceanographic data, and it was characterized from the very beginning by data sharing, by transforming data from individuals into actionable knowledge that was distributed to a community. And Maury would certainly be my hero if we were not, if I had not sided with the Confederacy for the Civil War that happened about 10 years later. That is my thing, that the Confederacy was a bad thing. Anyway, this integration that happened with physical oceanography, Commander Maury activities, is actually what we find also in meteorological sciences, that through the sharing of data, they were able to do global models very early. But this sharing of data and the standard that made that possible were never done for biological sciences. Biological oceanography never had something equivalent. And my friend Rainer Froese and I, we studied in Kiel, where the plankton was invented. Victor Hansen invented the concept of plankton. But he never invented or defined what was going to be shared when you talk about plankton. And plankton research was isolated from oceanography. And later, fishery science was also, because it was a very applied science, always separated. And there we are in a situation where gigantic surveys are conducted by fishery scientists, for example, that are never integrated and into oceanography and physical oceanography. And this integration, this missing integration, is actually a major problem. So I would lead a conversation asking what my colleague thinks are the major issues that we have to deal with to generate this integration and to facilitate it. And I will ask you to start because you, yeah.
Okay. Does this work? Yes. Yeah, I see, initially this panel was supposed to present the science drivers. What are the science questions that we're going to be addressing with the technology and the data sharing? The four big questions.
It's a very dangerous thing to do just by yourself when you
Yeah.
have all these esteemed colleagues out here who each have their own 3 or 4 great ideas they want
Yeah.
to do and accomplish.
Yeah.
So it's actually a death knell to be up here and be asked to do that. So
I mean, this is a
may not
very,
happen, so.
very illustrious group here,
Yeah.
and we're only 5, so we're going to need some audience participation in this.
yeah, please feel free to interrupt with questions.
The 4 big things that probably a lot of us can agree on is that we need to understand how ocean warming is going to affect productivity. We need to understand better how ocean acidification is going to affect organisms. We need to understand and mitigate overfishing problems. And then there's the big pollution. These are the four big ones. Now, how do you go about studying these things? You need data. You need coupled biological physical models. You need models of the ocean that are coupled to the atmosphere, and you need to view this whole thing as a Earth system model. I should point out here that the National Science Foundation is, in working with the National Academy of Sciences and Ocean Studies Board, came out with a report within the last year and a half about the infrastructure needs for ocean science in the year 2030. A really nice report, and they led off with a series of questions. What are the science questions for the future in ocean science? And there were about 26 questions that they had, pretty much all encompassing. They incorporated the 4 big ones that I mentioned. The question is, where do we go from here, knowing we have this baseline of scientific questions that we want to address? How do we proceed?
No, I was just going to add that there's actually been 7 reports or so, because I went through this in the last couple of years. Most recently, the Ocean Priorities for Science Priorities for an Ocean Nation, commissioned by the President, was updated 6 months ago. And these reports are remarkably similar, actually. They all seem to want to be at the interface of human interaction with the ocean. So it's often, you get into oceans and human health, you get into the economy, you get into ocean literacy for the public, but at the very top always is environmental change and ocean warming, climate change. One of these reports includes the 40 top priority research questions from Canada, from their core group they put together. The first dozen of those deal with climate change. They need to understand that. So, and they all recognize it's a temporal and spatial problem on various scales.
I wanted to mention one more thing about the NSF efforts, recent efforts. They've developed EarthCube, which many of you know about. It's a cyber infrastructure effort that's trying to create seamless data flow across disciplines within the geosciences so that the databases that are stovepiped into these individual disciplines can be shared more easily across. So I think the kind of suggestions and ideas that we come forth with in this symposium, we need to think about working with, obviously, with the NSF effort. And there's other CI, cyber infrastructure efforts as well that need to be integrated.
I forgot. I would ask each panelist. I would ask each panelist to introduce himself briefly. I had forgotten about that. But Paul.
Hi. Okay. Thank you very much, Dan. I'm Paul Falkowski at Rutgers University. I have a little slide. If somebody can flip it up for me. What I want to talk about for a second is there's an unintended consequence. Actually, it's a little anecdote to start. In the 1950s, when we started blowing up hydrogen bombs in the world, there was all this tritium. And there was tritium in the atmosphere. And Harold Urey knew how to measure tritium. He had discovered deuterium and won the Nobel Prize for it. And he didn't quite know how to get the air from previous years prior to when we blew up hydrogen bombs. So he called up Willard Libby, who was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, who had discovered carbon-14 and was an alcoholic, by the way. And he asked Willard Libby if he could buy cases of vintage champagne, because vintage champagne was the only wine in which the cork goes in the bottle in the year it says. And he bought champagnes from the 1930s, 1940s, and up to about the 2 years before, and he sampled them by putting a little needle in, withdrawing the tritium labeled air, and measuring the tritium. Now, I don't think that we should invite everybody to collect champagne just in case there's another explosion, but it's a way of thinking about unintended consequences of sampling. Now, if Harold Urey had not won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of deuterium, he should have won a Nobel Prize for that experiment. So, in my viewpoint, what we're always trying to do, I think, in oceanography and Earth system science in general, more generally, is to understand the history of the Earth. We're a very, very, very late-coming creature on this planet. Human beings, as Homo sapiens, only have lived for about 200,000 years. The Earth is about 4.56 billion years old. So the oceans are, in my mind, what I call a portrait gallery of life, or the history of life. Now, we have been able to access that much more efficiently over the last 20 years due to technologies. And that has been funded by Department of Energy in another unintended way for the Human Genome Sequencing Project, for example. But what we have now is, by incorporating those technologies into oceanography, a vast data stream that's like a fire hose of data. And finding patterns in nature have become a major, major, major problem. Major problem. So here's where a group of computer scientists and bioinformatics people have not really tackled the issue of the history of life on Earth. It's a very interesting problem to me. It's actually an embarrassment. Now, obviously the oceans are unique, but in this planet and to any other planet that we know of, in all the exoplanets that have been discovered so far, we have about 1,000 exoplanets that have been discovered. None of them have liquid water on them to our knowledge yet. And there's reasons why we have biases, and I don't want to go into that. But the real issue is here, that the very, very oxygen we breathe is, of course, due to the oxidation of water. Now, at the smallest scale, we don't understand how that nanomachine works. But that has cascaded into a very large scale to produce not a trace gas, but 21% of the atmospheric volume. So here I have a little question for the students, and here's getting back to an issue of energy. If you collapsed all of that oxygen back to water, how high would the sea level rise? There are 10 to the 19th moles of oxygen in the atmosphere. The sea level would only rise by about 1 meter. That's all. But if you do a calculation of how much energy did it take to create the 10 to the 19th moles, it's about 10 to the 9th to 10 to the 10th vanilla-flavored hydrogen bombs. So there's a heck of a lot of energy that has been used to create the oxygen we breathe. And yet, we don't tap that energy in a real way to produce alternative fuels for the future. And here's a very simple thing. You know, if I gave you a swimming pool full of water, I could power New York City for a day if I could split the water and just make that energy available. And it's a fascinating way of thinking about what it is that allowed the life on this planet to create an energy source that is so unique to the planet and is a marker of life on the planet. And finally, we have a hubris which is still with us. We think we're going to be stewards of the planet. We're very bad stewards. We have been bad stewards for a very, very long time. But as Marcia said, as we get to 9.5 billion people, being a steward on the planet is going to be the biggest challenge for us going forward. We're the fragile species. The oceans will be here long after we're gone. But we can't even hope to be stewards unless we understand the driver's manual, what I call, how the biogeochemical cycles interconnect to each other, how those genes really work, how they evolved, and why some of them are frozen and some of them work poorly, but that's what nature gave you, and it didn't change it. So those are major, major issues that I think require big data, looking for patterns in nature, and seeing opportunities in those patterns for altering our own behaviors. Thank you.
Okay, Rainer, introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Rainer Fröse. I'm a fisheries biologist by training and based in Kiel, Germany. And basically, Daniel and I started something 25 years ago, which had to deal very much with the buzzwords we heard today, which was trying to standardize data and make them publicly available. And I'm talking about a database on fish. And we picked fish because fisheries is our background, and we wanted basically to provide fisheries managers in the developing countries with all the information they needed to properly manage this resource. Okay? So that is your third bullet in a way, overfishing. Now, we distributed that in many ways, and today it's up on the internet. But the surprising thing is when we put it up, we were used by fisheries managers, yes. We also used by scientists, yes. But the overwhelming use was by laypersons, fish enthusiasts, aquarists, anglers, divers. So the system is up and running and has roughly close to 1 million visitors per month, every month, and about half of them come back within the month. And so this, and what we put up is not fancy. Actually, we are criticized often for not being fancy, not catering to beauty or what have you not. It's just the simple information, the scientific facts. And you can drill down from every number back to the publication where it's coming from. So very dry data up there is used a lot by many, many people. And if we look at our users, we find that, for example, translators are using it because they love our translation of common names. We have common names of fish in 100 languages. We are used by many others for other purposes that we had not expected, paleontologists and others. So what you said before is true. Now, why am I saying this? Back to our session here is, I think the biggest challenge that we face is connecting the well-organized chemical, physical, biological oceanographers with their global models and the understanding of the ocean up to the plankton level with our understanding of the rest of the food web, meaning the fish, the invertebrates, the marine mammals, and so on, and our usage of these animals. And we did 2 examples of that, and we will be done after that. One is a crazy idea that Daniel had, that is, let's try to understand what we're doing to the ocean by looking at the global catches that we take, and we know what species these are, and look at where they are in the food web. What is their trophic level? By combining these 2 pieces of information, we could show that basically fisheries, if you look at the time series, were fishing down the food web, the trophic level in the catches was going down. And it was called a wake-up call, basically by colleagues, because it showed the global impact that we had already, changing food webs in the ocean. And that was a citation classic. That's also another topic here. We have over 1,000 or close to 2,000 citations in the primary literature of that stuff. He's pointing at 3, yes. So that is really one way of doing it. Another one is, and I'm done after that, is basically how do you connect the physical, chemical, and so on data with the biological data. And we did one example of that. Basically, we call it environmental envelopes of fishes. That is, what are their preferences for temperature, depth, range, salinity, primary productivity, and one more parameter, very simple, 5. And where do these occur in the oceans? And that is called niche modeling. So we have authority database that gives us these properties for the whole ocean, and we know what the preferences of the fish are. If you combine that, you have maps. And I have one slide there, which I just, if you can bring that up, the Aquamaps thing, that is the one. That's up and running on the internet, and if you click anywhere on the oceans, if you click somewhere near Hawaii or so, it will show you a list of all species that occur there. And if you were to click on, you can do that on, if you're connected, you will find information about this species. If you click on, you will find its growth, maturity, fecundity, what have you not. If you click on, you find the reference where it came from. So this is really drilling down to scientific information in a very easy way. Okay, thank you.
So, Renier, what happens if you put that into a framework of a warming ocean?
We also have this in the future. So there is a link there. How will this was global biodiversity of marine organisms, 17,000 species, all marine mammals, all marine reptiles, the turtles, half of marine fish, many others, 17,000 so far. And yeah, there we have see some of the stuff in below. So the question was?
What happens in the future ocean?
In the future, okay. Since we know from you guys what the properties of the ocean will be projected in 100 years, we can tell you where these species will be in 100 years, and these maps are also online.
This also exists through envelope models that William Chung and I have been publishing in the last years, where the fish actually move from year to year, given little models that act in every cell. And we can we could fill in the ocean before the envelope models have been applied only to terrestrial organisms. And we could fill in for the ocean, and that was published in Nature Climate Science and other outlets. We know that, sorry, I have a little problem here. Basically, the movement that are documented for individual species, we could integrate them in a single model. And thank you very much. And so we know now what roughly will happen with in the next years. So
Don't hold. I hold it for you.
yeah, there is a microphone to hold and a bottle to hold. This is the other way around. Sorry. What is our next move? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to say that that's an excellent example of data mining. There's a lot of data that could see the light of day that hasn't seen the light of day before and been presented to us. There's also dark data in people's filing cabinets and on their computers that might have a difficult time ever surfacing. But there's undoubtedly a huge repository of data that can be retrieved. I think perhaps maybe an even bigger problem, at least from the perspective of a plankton biologist, is the sparseness of data in general and the need to collect new data. If you think about how to go about studying a particular region or the ocean basin itself, if you have a coupled biological physical model of a particular area or of the ocean basin, and you start to run that model, the first thing you need to know is what the initial conditions are. You need to have some data to initialize the model for the interior points, for the boundary points, and then as the model progresses, you need to have data to validate the model, to incorporate it into, incorporate the data into the model for forecasting, nowcasting. One of the problems, in certain areas we have a fair amount of data, like Georges Bank, Gulf of Maine area, but in a lot of areas we don't have any. In the areas where we do have data, it's often too sparse anyway. Like, for instance, I think the submesoscale variability is extremely important, and we haven't been measuring it very well. As an example, Paul and I were on a cruise with Dennis McGillicuddy on an Eddy study south of Bermuda. And we towed the VPR, our underwater microscope, with high resolution through this eddy, and we found diatom blooms in the center of the eddy. We put a CTD in the bloom, measured the chlorophyll and the cell counts. We found higher concentrations of chlorophyll and diatoms there than had ever been reported in the 20-year history of bats. One of these eddies coming through the bat site can account for the bulk of the annual production and flux at the site. So, I mean, these episodic and small-scale events need to be incorporated for us to get a better understanding of the biogeochemical cycling in the ocean. The other thing is that I think where we're really lacking in data, having worked with this imaging of plankton for 20 years now, I'm always fascinated at these small scales, the scale of the individual, what you see, and probably 50 to 90% of what we see is fragile plankton, especially marine snow. Alice Aldrich was dead on when she's promoting marine snow importance, because it's really, out of all of the mesoplankton-sized particles that we see over, we've towed the VPR the equivalent of several times around the world in all the major oceans. Marine snow is ubiquitous, as are a lot of small, mesoplankton-sized colonial forms and fragile forms. These things don't appear in net samples, and when you sample them with a Niskin bottle like we typically do, we'll go out and we send a CTD rosette down, we collect water, we bring it up, we take some water out of the bottle through the spigot. When you're looking at this, these particles, the marine snow particles in situ, you see that they've got all kinds of little, they're a little community among of themselves. And when you pull that through the spigot of the Niskin bottle, the whole thing gets homogenized. Then we do our dilution grazing experiments, our incubations on this completely changed system. How do those rates, we put those rates then, how do they relate to nature? We put those rates into our models that we're using to predict the future and the flux, the downward flux of carbon and the biogeochemical cycles. So I think that one of the things that we can, one of the approaches, sort of a vision that we could use is to have, you envision the global ocean with all the Argo floats. If we had something like that with low-cost drifters or gliders, each with sensors that could measure the taxonomic identification as well as temperature, salinity, and other environmental variables. Envision the globe covered with these sensors, sending back data via satellite to the shore. The data are assimilated into a coupled biological physical model that then communicates back with these robotic samplers in an adaptive way and tells them where the uncertainties are. So we have these nowcasts and forecasts with uncertainties. The robots move into the areas where the uncertainty is, grab more data, send it back, and so you have this adaptive feedback model that's going to give us a lot more accuracy and robustness. Now, this kind of global observing system, adaptive global observing system, could be a real breakthrough in the sense, similar sense to the way the weather got improved when we started getting satellites, our eyes in the skies. You can envision this kind of global modeling observing system, adaptive system, as our eyes in the ocean. And so that's one view that other people here probably also share.
Every time I hear Cabell talk about plankton, I think about food for the benthos. And more importantly, right? So no, it's great that Cabell explains that complex system that exists that changes temporally and very dynamic. But it's true that these phytoplankton, these zooplankton, end up on the deep sea floor, and they have a marked impact on the diversity and the abundance of species that are able to live there, and it changes on a temporal scale dramatically. And how do we? The nutrient cycling on the deep sea floor is very dynamic and it's very important. And you know, we have hypotheses now about the deep ocean trenches, things below 6,000 meters that actually accumulate carbon in our sinks in our deep sea. So you know, we have hypotheses, we haven't gotten out there yet, right? So I put it to the fact that how do we gain data? How do we get access? How do we develop in situ sensors, autonomous platforms that let us go down to the deep sea and see the impact of the changes? When the ocean warms, the plankton are going to change, things are going to change, so is the deep sea is going to change. And so maybe those sinks are going to change. We really don't know, but do we have baselines? Do we have anything like that? Do we learn something from the Gulf spill that we need baselines? We had so few, right? Critically important. So you had, I mean, I can come up with dreams of thinking about things that are crawling on the seafloor, that are sitting down there, and we fly by with an AUV and we download the data while the AUV's flying by. A lot of this is actually doable, believe it or not. These measurements are doable. It's a matter of funding and coordination. So,
yeah. I am a bit worried that this the technology to acquire new data, as described and as necessary, is running away from our ability to integrate and make sense of them. There is, in the marine biology and fisheries field, overemphasis on local studies, on local situation, and an immense difficulty in making conclusions that are valid for a larger area and assimilating data from larger areas. And this problem cannot be overemphasized. This is the reason why this dichotomy we can talk about the ocean, and here, and most of you mean the lower trophic level. And yet, what most people know about the ocean and most people want about the ocean is actually getting fish to eat. And this is the major interaction with the ocean. And if we abstract from transport over the ocean, that we don't really influence them most, our major influence is through fishing. And we remove life from the ocean massively. We have a technology to do that. And then when life is changed, we wonder, why is it changed? Because of pollution? No, because we have taken this stuff out. We have taken life out of the ocean. We do that, especially in a higher trophic level. And this disconnect that we study the ocean, the processes at lower trophic level in a detailed fashion, or over large scale, over large time period also, because we have paleoceanography to help us out, but we don't look at the big massive influence of fishing fleet. The Falco is a tiny boat compared with the vessels that fish, the fishing vessels that are deployed to remove life from the ocean. That is supposed to study it, but there is thousands of vessels that are there to remove it from the ocean, and that study is not done in parallel with the physics, and that I'm really worried about it. And when this system proposed that would generate this flood of new data, I wonder about the position in universities or the institution that will be there analyzing the data. The Census of Marine Life, this is a major project that was concluded about 10 years ago, has actually left no institution that will analyze what has been collected during the 10 years of the project. Zero. Has created zero institution, zero position that will analyze the taxonomics, the sample of life that have been sampled. None whatsoever. It was a fluff piece, largely, because it has, contrary to the Challenger expedition, left no trace. It has left no trace. We have written about this, and this is to the consternation of lots of people, actually.
Yeah. Well, there is a database that...
Oh, sorry. We
yeah.
should... Actually, I wanted to open questions. This is perfect.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm Alice Aldridge from Santa Barbara. I am looking at the title of this panel and realizing that if we had a group of information managers up here, IT experts, that this discussion would be going in a very different way. I'm part of an LTER network, a long-term ecological research program, and there the scientists inform our IT people, but they're really the ones who turn around and tell us how to make our data really accessible and available, and how to do the standards as well. We have standards across the 26 LTER sites. So I think that this particular topic needs a lot more, to be a lot more informed by the people who kind of know how to get the data out there and get it accessible to others besides the actual people who collected it.
I agree, Alice. But it's another panel. But I think the issues here that I think we're trying to explain or express are what are the scientific drivers going, what is the intellectual content? So let's just think about it for a second. You and I get money from the National Science Foundation, and many other people in the room do as well. And we're trained, we're ingrained, we're forced to have hypothesis-driven science. That's an inductive reasoning. So we can think about the three reasoning concepts in logic. We have deductive reasoning. We hardly ever use that in our science. It's used more in law. We have inductive reasoning, which is the hypothesis-driven science. And then there is another and a third, which we often ignore, which Marcia obliquely alluded to, which is abductive reasoning, which is observation leading to hypotheses. So if I write a proposal to the National Science Foundation asking to do observations without an hypothesis, it will go nowhere. It will die, right? So the question really is how to discover phenomena which we don't really understand. And no IT guy is going to tell me that. No IT guy is going to give me that information. What I really need to know from the IT guys is how to form patterns of of information that yield new insight into how the system works, right? And there's standards, we can go through all the processes here, but that's really where the discovery of the phenomena are. So I'll give you an example that's really sort of oblique, but, and maybe even opaque, but if you are taking fish out of the top of the food chain, that leaves a lot more calories that are going to be consumed by microbes. All right? That's not going, now that is a heat content change at a microscopic level. We should be able to determine the heat content change at a microscopic level. So I can measure, and I've done this with microbes, changes in heat content of 10 to the minus 9th degrees. I can tell you exactly their caloric consumption. And there's a basal rate. And these biophysical techniques are not used now. So there are a whole suite of technologies that I can envision. I'll give you another very simple example, Alice, one which may appeal to you and many other in the room. So there was an experiment that was done in the Mediterranean, just near Marseille. And it was putting down detectors to look at neutrinos. These are single photon counting detectors down deep in the ocean. Does anybody know about this experiment? Remember this? And then all of a sudden, these detectors go to the moon. They're just saturated, right? What was happening? It turned out that a few weeks earlier, there had been a phytoplankton bloom, and that was sinking into the seafloor, and the guys that were down there were in a feeding frenzy and glowing. They were just glowing in the dark because they were being fed by some phytoplankton bloom 2 weeks ago. So I can imagine all kinds of wonderful technologies that would inform us of how the system works from a remote sensing way. Now, to get back, I just want to have one thought about this in another way that's kind of interesting. I was talking last night with John Delaney about this. The vision of informing our populace. I work on corals as well. I could imagine putting out 20 cameras around the world that are on coral reefs, just sitting there, being cleaned by citizen scientists that come down as scuba divers and just cleaning the lenses, making sure the batteries are refreshed and so on. But having that piped in to, say, 3rd to 5th grade classrooms across the nation. And every day you're walking in your 5th grade class and you're seeing the animals not in the aquarium, but in the Caribbean. And if there's a global warming event and those corals bleach and those animals die, you've lost your pets. Now that's a very real phenomenon. You've just internalized the phenomena and made the ocean real to those kids. And I'd love to see that kind of engagement more. These are not random thoughts. These are linked thoughts about how to go from the hard science to something that really impacts us as people. And that's just a thought.
To answer,
There's a connection here, Paul, to something else. It's a very good observation in that I'm not sure where to start, but there's an example here of the philosophy you're talking about, first of all. When you get in front of NSF and you go out, you have a hypothesis, you do go out and make observations. You refine that hypothesis, you move it around a little bit, it moves. But there's another way that we've been doing it. It's increasing year to year. Even during the year, we're getting more months at sea with exploration and through telepresence. And seeing 180,000 people tune in to the web to see us with an ROV on the seafloor, listening to science, not just kids watching an image change or whatever, which point well taken. And I think the technology of telepresence is ramping up to an exponential level. We're going to deal with the data from that too. That's another issue. But I think to bring your thought home is just that. That is a fantastic way to reach out to people, to the youth of the world, and also to educate ourselves. I just had 40 scientists on an expedition this summer through telepresence, geologists, chemists, different kinds of biologists, and we all, the senior level PIs there, were learning tremendous amount, in addition to the students. So it's a point well taken. I really do like the idea that, you think about Darwin and what hypothesis did Darwin have when he started looking at barnacles and other things. He was an observationalist. He looked and he looked and he looked for patterns. Right? And so the challenges we're going to have is we're going to start looking, we're going to collect a lot of data, we've got to identify the patterns. Maybe that's where SOI can really come into play too, helping us find those patterns in the data.
And then,
Yeah.
question here.
I'm Julie Huber from the MBL, and this is a great follow-up before the two of you spoke, but whenever I'm trying to get my NSF speak on and talk about integrative, quantitative model, framework, whatever, and I'm a deep sea microbiologist, I'm reminded that some of the greatest discoveries in marine microbiology were not predicted, right? Maybe a biogeochemist said, that process is going on, and a microbiologist said, we've never seen it. Then with the genomics revolution and all these other things, they've found it. Proteorhodopsin is another great example. And so I think it's really hard when I think about even building a model at a place I know very well, like some place on the seafloor that I've been 10 times. I feel like there always has to be this part of the model that's open, right, for some new discovery, something that we might not predict, a new type of virus, for example, or a new metabolism or something like that. And so I think it's always really important to keep the discovery part in these, you know, these models that we're going to predict this, and that, and remember how important that is. So it follows up to what you guys were just saying.
So one of the ways that discoveries are made, and one of the most important ways discoveries are made, are by instrumentation that have been applied in a totally different field, or even inventing new instruments. And here we come down to, it's kind of like we don't really teach instrumentation. It's almost a hidden art form. So Pete Gerges and I have been talking about this. A lot of people have, you know, if we were to make instrumentation something that we could incorporate into the education possibilities, not necessarily mandatorily, but have that as a graduate program in how to make scientific instrumentation, I think that would be an amazing leap forward in our ability to discover things. Really amazing.
We have more questions.
Leighton Ollie, I'm from SOI. I'm one of the marine technicians on board. I've got a question. We're talking here about putting this data out into the community, which is a really, really good thing. But is there emphasis that that can be abused on, for example, on your graph you showed where all the sharks were. Now are those sharks' fins going to end up on a roof in Hong Kong somewhere? With regards to fishing, our real-time echo sounder data, which we could broadcast onto the internet, shows where the fish are. We've done work with telepresence looking at red ruffy. Well, there's been a trawler stood off our side in my previous job. In the Southern Ocean, we've been there using the EK60 looking at krill while another boat's ready to suck it up. Putting that data out is a great thing, but sometimes is there an ethical question that as a steward of the planet, as you're saying, that sometimes pumping out too much data is actually causing the problems which help see the decline by putting that out there?
Yeah, I can respond to that, and we're facing this question, but for fisheries, actually there's no issue. They know much better where and when and at what depth and at what time and so on the fish are than we can ever show in our relatively crude global maps. These maps have a resolution of half a degree, and so that's much too coarse for any of that. But we face this question with endangered species, which often have a collector price item on them, and some of them are only in very, very narrow localities. And so actually, yes, we do blur the coordinates for those. So we're aware of the issue, and so for threatened species, rare species, collector items, yes, we blur the locality. You will get at a 1 degree level, but not more.
Hi, I wanted to comment on your comment about your disappointment that IT people couldn't help you with your fundamental science. I did OpenGL and invented Google Earth and work at Google, so I guess I would qualify as a IT person. My name is Michael Jones. One of the suggestions I had for Eric Schmidt maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and then he put forward to government, I put forward to government, had to do with the NSF funding model. Basically, everybody who in the US who is a, quote, real scientist, basically does what the NSF will pay for. And for the most part, that means gathering data, producing a minimum publishable result, holding on to the data as long as possible, and then going back with a submission for a follow-on project with a very high probability of positive result. And that isn't the scientist's fault. The NSF has basically made them prostitute themselves to do that. That's very different than what real science is about, which is exploration, asking new questions, failure is as likely as success, and so forth. So what I had proposed to Eric was that we, and to the NSF, that President Obama expand the funding, whatever amount that was going to be, was $1, $1 billion, whatever it was, but that the funding go into a new kind of money. So the old money was like the, say, green money. The new money is like blue money, and the blue money can only be spent to basically collect data that you publish contemporaneously. And so it's the data gathering kind of money. And that in out years, you would give more money to people who gathered data that was cited by other scientists. So you build an economy of data gathering, and data sharing. And then over time, the NSF could sneakily just turn the knob to more and more of the blue money and less of the green money. And that didn't go anywhere with the NSF, so that's on their shoulders. But I do think that at least you can have the confidence that the IT people can help you solve your own problems.
I like the idea. Let me give you, one of my close friends is Pierre Joliot, who's the grandson of Marie Curie. So we were discussing, Marie Curie's PhD thesis was 24 pages. And it was just the discovery of radium. I mean, what can you say? And if I had a world in which to make it the way I think would work functionally, I'd say, okay, you got your PhD. You now are allowed 10 papers to write in your entire life. That's it. Your career consists of 10 papers. And if you want to co-author, you can co-author it with, and that counts as a half, no matter how many co-authors are on the paper, okay? So the maximum number of papers you can ever have in your life is 20. Now, the signal-to-noise ratio would probably go up tremendously in the scientific community, right? Because now you have to really think about it. What is it, are you really going to shoot that bullet now, or you want to keep it back and, make something really important? And I think that's a major problem now is, that we have this incentive to publish and publish and publish and publish and publish. And Marcia knows very well, I don't know, what do we get, 12,000, 15,000 submissions to Science a year, of which there's about a 6% acceptance rate, and the other 16,000 go to Nature. Everybody is doing this. And then you flip them around and you go to, there's no, those, the PNAS, the previously at Nature and Science. So that's, that's the food chain. So that's fishing down the food chain for scientific publications. And it doesn't really help us. It doesn't really help us to see the signal for the noise. So in the IT world, I was being a little facetious and probably a little bit harsh, but the point is that I'd like to see patterns. I'd like to see the ability to use data as easily as possible to see large patterns, large-scale patterns, right? That is what science, to me, is about. And it's very, very difficult now to either use the data, accessing it, putting it into a common platform. Those are all sociological as well as technological problems. But at the end of the day, what are the questions? And here's where I think that the scientific community has not raised the bar enough. We have not raised the bar in oceanography enough, okay? So that's really what I think the first order problem is in the field, is to raise that bar, to have the biggest, boldest questions out there. Because you cannot continue, we cannot continue in this field to just continue to do, again, another mesoscale study, another, these kinds of things. We cannot do that anymore. We have to raise the bar to be related to a larger cross-section of science and have a larger impact across the field.
Yeah, Mike Coffin from the University of Tasmania. Following up on what Wendy and Marcia said earlier about citizen engagement and community involvement, turning the tone slightly here, and also what Daniel and Reiner said, I'd like to give a couple of examples from Australia of what we're doing to engage citizens in science. One is called REDMAP, for Range Extension Data Mapping Project. So we organize, originally in Tasmania, now it's gone Australia-wide, divers, recreational divers, whenever they're down, or fishers, recreational, commercial fishers, and see a fish that they don't recognize in the waters in which they're fishing, they take a picture of it, they send it to us via the internet, we look at it, we identify it, and we're able to see where species are moving where they haven't lived before, so it's a great monitor of climate change and the changing ocean dynamic environment. So that's one project, REDMAP. The other is called Reef Life Survey, which is based in Australia but is global. This is a series of transects around tropical, subtropical, and temperate reefs around the world that recreational divers combined with scientists go out and do these repeat transects year after year. And apologies to Marcia, but the latest compilation was just published in Nature a few weeks ago, where this citizens-based data, doing repeat transects, over hundreds of transects, thousands, tens of thousands of measurements, actually has made it into Nature as a publication with an accompanying news and views. So I think through these kinds of projects, we're really engaging the public and bringing people from outside the sciences into the science and helping to communicate that science back out to the general public.
I wonder if we can reframe the conversation just a bit, because I kind of get the sense that it's not them and us. NSF is us in many ways. The people who are reviewing your proposals are us, and therefore, I just think that we might have to think about it differently, and we are in this room to discuss this. So I would like to throw out a couple of challenges, which is, how do we advise NSF to do things in new ways? Yeah. There is an advisory board there are mechanisms to do this, and therefore, we can do that. And the other thing is, going back to the IT question, how do we challenge ourselves within the academic system to train people to do the domain science and data science together? This, again, is something that, rather than lobbing the question across the fence, is something that we as academics should be able to sort of live up to the challenge and figure out how we change the system within the universities that we work in.
So I don't know which of us wants to answer the NSF question. And Ryan can't, because we are not.
All of us know the NSF problem is that when we are in our own private rooms looking at our competitors' proposals, we can be very vicious, and especially because it's anonymous. And you and I have seen those reviews, and they are sometimes amazingly negative, and unnecessarily so. And it's not just because we have a culture which is very stressed for money, it's that we are very ungracious to each other. And this proposal pressure has led to, I think, a huge problem for the entire community. Now, we've discussed this many times across the many years I've been here, and one of the major problems is that we have no birth control in terms of the number of graduate students we produce. And then it's exactly the same problem with the National Institute of Health. Harold Varmus doubled the funding of NIH. Everybody in NIH had 5 postdocs, 10 postdocs, in some cases 100 postdocs, literally 100 postdocs. And after 3 years, they would go off, and they'd all want to have their own labs, and it was the sorcerer's apprentice problem. So what we really have to do here is really figure out how do we train people and educate people in marine sciences to be the very, very best, and yet not produce 2,000 or 3,000 over a decade, which just is not sustainable. So that's, first of all, my take on the NSF problem. The second issue of IT, I think, is a much more interesting one in terms of it's solvable. The first one is a social problem. It's not so easily solvable.
The other question that you posed is that's one I understood. How do we relate to the IT people when we, for example, want to create a database? And the experience that we gain in producing this, if I can say, very successful database, is that we had to control very much from the science what would be in the database, and we had to ensure that it was encodable, that there was a procedure and people and funds to encode the data, and that we didn't have a database that was designed by the IT people, and at the end there was no procedure for entering data. You had the competing models that existed in Europe, for example. They use all the funds that they had for in a 2-year or 3-year cycle from the European Union for designing a database. And then it was for one animal, it was designed for one animal or one case study, and then the project finished. You have to design the database from the content, and it has, every bit of content has to have a strategy for encoding it and getting the data in, a data stream in, over time. And if you don't have that, there's no need to design a database around it. And we found that I hate to say that, but the IT people were not useful. This had to be driven by the scientists themselves, from the content. And the experience was that the content-driven database always beat the design database that has the fancy bells and stuff, but no content. Do you want to add to this?
Yeah, that's correct. Actually, IT has been a moving target for us. I don't know, we are on the 5th type of database. We moved from something that was DBase in the beginning to Microsoft Access, to MySQL, and so on. And every time, and the more you invest in any of these, the more difficult it is to switch to the next, because they all die and disappear. So really, if you want to keep your content alive, you have a major challenge to keep your system as simple and bare bones as possible. So one of the big issues we always had with IT people is, oh, you have not normalized your database enough. There is redundancy here and there. We said, yes, that's on purpose. Because if I open a table, I can understand it as a scientist. And if you looked at other databases, you open it, you saw a string of numbers. Well, what does that mean? Well, that's the link to the other table, which has a link to the other table, which there is the one. And it was just crazy. And looking at other exercises parallel to us, most of them have disappeared and failed because when the project ended or the programmer left, nobody could anymore do anything with it. So that is really a point that the content is what we insisted on and the simplicity that we insisted upon, and that has paid off. We have done this for 25 years. We started on diskettes until it was 20 diskettes that we sent around, then CD, until it was 3, 4, then DVD, then luckily the internet came around. But technology and IT actually has a nightmare for us. It's a pain in the neck. Also programmers, we have stuff that is with us for 25 years encoding data. Programmers change every 3 years, sometimes 1 year. Once we brought them up to level, they're too good to stay with us, they move on. So sorry being so negative about IT, but content is what counts.
We have 4 minutes left in this panel. The best would be to have more questions and answers, quick answers.
Thanks.
So I wanted to follow up on the discussion that's been going on about hypothesis-driven versus exploratory research. I'm a deep sea microbiologist, and I wanted to assure some of the younger people in the room in particular, because I feel like there's been a lot of negativity about exploratory research, that exploratory research is perfectly fundable, even within NSF. I think Schmidt and other foundations can play a really important role in furthering that objective, but I think that there is a place in NSF, and I've never had trouble raising money for myself at NSF doing exploratory research in the deep ocean. I also want to bring up something regarding technology that I don't think has been brought up as of yet, but it's really important in terms of the history of ocean research, which is the role that the ocean drilling program has been playing in scientific research in the deep ocean since the mid-1960s. Basically, they discovered and proved the hypothesis that of continental drift, right, plate tectonics, through the use of the ocean drilling program. Microbiology then came on the scenes in the mid-1980s. I think this is important for people to keep in mind. This was entirely exploratory, based on just microbiologists deciding to sail along, collect some muds that were being collected for trying to catalog the history of Earth's climate, which, by the way, in terms of our discussion about Earth's history and climate, it's important to recognize that the ocean drilling program is actually the platform that has proven how temperatures have increased, right? Ice cores and all that stuff cannot record how the temperatures of the oceans have increased over geological times. That's all done through ocean drilling research. And now there's, of course, a big push for microbiology in the latest phase of the ocean drilling program. But it's an important exploratory technology that is being exploited. There's a lot of ocean observatories that are going into the grounds right now that are similar to what's been done in the upper water column for decades, like HOTS and BATS and so on and so forth. Okay. So I just hope that we bring this into the discussion later on.
Okay. That was more of a comment, so we will not.
I had a question, actually. Speaker Riggers from Harvard University. I appreciate the terrain that this panel has covered, and you even touched upon birth control, for crying out loud. So I wanted to kind of basically start by sharing a quick anecdote and then pose a question that has a sort of a sociological and kind of mechanistic dimension to the question. So the anecdote is this. So my colleagues and I run an early career program for the Deep Submergence Steering Committee. And in that program, as well as at EarthCube meetings, I have asked the question, how many of you here, early career scientists, would be interested in pursuing a career where you focused on analyzing this vast extent of data that already exists? Would you do that? If you never stepped foot on a ship, would you be interested in engaging oceanography this way if the support were available? And it was like the majority of the people in the audience raised their hands. Now, there are probably two facets to this. One, of course, is they're all looking for any kind of job that relates to oceanography. But I do think it's an important reminder that the way students think about the world today is different than the way we're trained to think about the world. And I think there is a hunger for engaging in oceanography through these kinds of data analysis. So the question is this, how do we set out to both train and support scientists who are interested in tackling these sort of immense questions through the exploration and analysis of these immense data sets?
I will leave this to another panel, not because we couldn't give it a shot, but because this thing is blinking at me and is saying 28, 29, and at some number it will explode. And so please forgive us for having been all over the place, including family planning. This was difficult. That will be easier for the other panel that have seen us make fool ourselves and that will have more specific questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. There are so many more questions waiting there. Everybody waiting in line. So please submit your questions over the net. We actually got quite a few other questions online as well, but we weren't able to answer them. We'll have a short coffee break, and the coffee and little desserts outside. And we'll be back promptly, maybe a couple minutes before 11, so we can be ready for the next